This is Heal Your Mind, Heal Your Body with Dr. Schuyler. Discover how your thoughts manifest disease and what you can do about it. Here's your host, Dr. Schuyler.
Hello. Welcome back, beautiful souls. I am actually really excited to get into today's episode because it's actually very personal for me and my journey and kind of how I got to this place. And I think it's going to be relevant for so many people out there because 80 million people are diagnosed with autoimmune disease. 80% of that is women, and there's over 100 autoimmune disorders out there. So, today I want to talk about the mind body connection as it relates to autoimmune disorders. And as many of you may or may not know, I was once diagnosed with multiple sclerosis back in 2002. And after the birth of my second child in 2010, I was in a wheelchair. But right prior to that, I was going blind in my left eye from so much nerve damage from having the diagnosis and just kind of overdoing it. And, as I've become this person that has devoted my life to understanding the mind body connection and really beginning to think outside of the box of what causes the mind body connection disease process. I took this self deep dive into, what elements did contribute to my disease process. And that's how I came up with where science and the psychology merge, the interplay between the two of them, but really looking at from an outside perspective, looking at things like chronic invalidation and attachment styles and the ways that we have grown up and how we perceive stress, and so that's how it came to be understanding the psychology of it, chronic invalidation, attachment, and what healing phase we're in. Today, we're returning back into the basics of what is the disease process as it relates to stress. So last week, we really went into a deep dive. What exactly is stress and why does it cause GI disorders? So with that deeper breakdown of stress from last week's episode, we're going to pan out a little bit more and look at the mind-body connection as the autoimmune process. So I've talked about, I think previously, the safety-based theory that I developed with a brilliant colleague of mine, Dr. Lewis Damas. And in 2020, we published in American Society for Clinical Hypnosis, a journal, and we developed this theory called the Central Florida Protocol. And it's a safety-based theory. When we increase the sense of safety in people, we increase something called neuroception, the threat detection milliseconds before the limbic system kicks in. When we increase the sense of safety, it decreases IBS symptoms and it decreased anxiety and actually increased the feeling of safe and warm affect. When you feel good and fuzzy inside, it increased that. So what we, really began to differentiate was that you can feel a sense of low arousal, which means you can be tired, but you don't feel safe. And a better way to explain this, if you think of a prisoner of war, they're going to experience lulls of low arousal where they're going to, at some point in time, their body becomes so relaxed, they're going to fall asleep. But that does not mean they feel safe. Just because you feel at a slower, lower arousal, you may feel relaxed and not your mind relaxed, but your body may feel relaxed, is not indicative of feeling safe. So when we say when someone's stressed out, oh, just relax, relax. A, that's just infuriating. But B, that's not actually looking at the organic reason why that person's experiencing that heightened sense. We're feeling unsafe, either whether it be angry or overstressed or overworked. So when we were looking at this study and looking at the science behind it, and so much science supporting that in order for us to heal, we must feel safe. So in order for us to play, we must feel safe. And the antidote of trauma is actually playfulness. And that's why I like to always tell people, look for the childlike wonderment in life. And I think if we can all operate from the sense of childlike wonderment, that means we're operating from a place of safety. That's a lot of times why I go to the park with my pediatric patients and we swing on the swing and I literally do cartwheels. You can ask a number of them. I'd usually do cartwheels on the walks, or we hang by the monkey bars. When you can begin to experience life through this sense of wonderment, that means you feel safe. So, how did I go from doing cartwheels, working with patients, and us running around and being kids outside, which is so therapeutic for their healing, to have been in a wheelchair where nothing felt safe to me? And that's what I want to start explaining, getting into the automatic negative thoughts, the stress contagion, the cortisol, the limbic, and then how that plays in chronic invalidation. As I mentioned, 80 million people have an autoimmune disease. That's more than cancer, heart disease, and diabetes combined. Combined. That's how prevalent these autoimmune disorders are. So when we looked at we're going to dial back a little bit into the gut brain just because it really does tie into autoimmune and gut microbiome. When we look at the gut brain axis, it's that bidirectional communication that links the central nervous system to the enteric nervous system. That's the gut nervous system. It's called the ENS. And that is really involves neural, hormonal, and immunological signaling pathways. So the ENS, what connects the brain to the gut, involves neural, hormonal, and immunological pathways. That's important to remember why this is relevant to autoimmune. So we went over last time how much stress influences bodily functions, including gut health. We went over how cortisol in the GI tract impacts motility and sensitivity. It also really significantly disrupts the gut microbiome, which leads to dysbiosis. Dysbiosis is this disruption in gut microbiome, which contributes to inflammation and inflammation in the GI tract and inflammation in the body. So now we in the GI tract. Now let's just go out a little bit bigger in the body. Let's pull out the focus a little bit bigger and go into the immune system. When you look at cortisol, the stress response, the immune suppression, it's great during short term running from something, but it also causes this chronic inflammation. This immune suppression is, while in a short burst of cortisol, helps modulate inflammation. Chronic high levels suppress the immune system's ability to fight infection. You're not going to heal a paper cut when you're running from a tiger. So, autoimmune disease occur when the immune system mistakenly attacks the body's own tissues. And the GI tract is really involved with this because due to its extensive immune system presence and its constant exposure to these antigens, these bad guys, stress, cortisol, and the GI tract have an interplay with autoimmunity. So look at leaky gut permeability. Think eczema and psoriasis. And this is when particles begin to leave the GI tract and go into the bloodstream. It's this increased permeability. So chronic stress and high cortisol can increase intestinal permeability. When the gut barrier is compromised, larger molecules like toxins, and I'm going to repeat that, toxins leave the gut and go out into the bloodstream. Undigested food particles pass through the gut lining into the bloodstream. Stress literally breaks down our GI tract, and toxins get out in the body and they filtrate around our bodies and our blood. And this has an immune activation. These foreign molecules, these foreign toxins trigger this immune response. This leads to systemic inflammation, systemic meaning whole body, potentially contributing to the development of autoimmune conditions. So, this dysbiosis, this imbalance in the gut microbiome, it alters immune function. So, certain microbial patterns are associated with either promoting tolerance or triggering autoimmune reactions. So, we're going to break this down even further, called molecular mimicry. So, some bacteria share structural similarities with host tissues. So, this is what's so fascinating. Your immune response against this bacteria, your body mistakenly targets its own cells, attacks its own cells, leading to autoimmune disease. And this is where we're going to get into a little bit more. Remember, stress, autoimmunes, uh, linked to chronic invalidation, whether it be medical or family, your attachment style, your stress contagion. So now we're looking at the cortisol. Dysregulation can lead to production of these pro-inflammatory called cytokines. And these cytokines perpetuate inflammation even further. So now we have chronic inflammation. This persistent inflammation in the gut leads to systemic effects, which is the progression of things like Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, and celiac disease. So when we look at these elements, the science of the mind-body connection, we break it down as the four elements of the science is the emotions. What are you feeling? Out of the 48,000 negative thoughts a day, roughly 80% of our thoughts are negative. What emotions are tied to those? What automatic negative thoughts? I'm never going to get better. Why am I always so sick? Why has this happened to me? Why do I look fat in these jeans? Why does no one call me back? Why is no one liking my post? Why is there a war? Why is nothing ever goes right for me? All these automatic negative thoughts and this stress contagion. you know, Hanging out with people that stress you out, even if you don't recognize they stress you out. The number one complaint I get from literally every person that I am blessed and honored enough to work with, other people's stress is making them sick. It's never their own. It literally is work, parents, partner, friendships, or how they were treated as a child. People don't come to therapy because they've hurt themselves. They come to therapy because other people have hurt them. Think about that. People go to therapy because other people have hurt them. Autoimmune condition is really, really linked to who you surround yourself with, how much people around you are influencing your health. And when you look at previous episodes about fight, flight, or frozen, and autoimmune disease is often unexpressed anger and rage. And I talk about this in the fight response. Having have healed from multiple sclerosis, I can absolutely, from firsthand experience, anger was definitely something that I was not comfortable or safe or even allowed to really express. So when that just becomes pent up and you begin to stuff it, you begin to resent yourself. Then you begin to resent the other person. Then you actually may turn into even hating yourself. And remember, the body can't differentiate what the mind is thinking. So if you have thoughts like, oh my gosh, I hate myself. I hate this about me. I hate that about me. We can't be surprised when the body begins to betray us. The body's like, oh, you hate you? All right, I got this. I'll take over now. All right, what do I need to do to hate you? We know that trauma stores in the body. We know this. It's shown evidence-based up to 3 generations. Emotions store in the body. What is trauma? Trauma is not what happened to our ancestors 3 generations ago. Trauma is the emotion that's stored in their DNA that gets passed down to us. It's not the war that they were in 3 generations ago, not the event, the emotions. That's what gets passed down in the DNA. When we are not allowed to express our emotions, especially anger, our limbic response kicks in, and this prolonged limbic response of fight often is linked to autoimmune conditions when it comes to the mind-body connection. And when you look at the limbic system and its brain structures, it involves emotions, behaviors, and long-term memory. How many people out there can't remember a lot about their childhood? Now, odds are it's not some massive thing that you're repressing, some memory. I mean, that does happen, but not nearly as often as I see a child who's grown up in chronic fight or flight response. When you live in a chronic fight or flight, that impacts your memory. And stress can exacerbate autoimmune diseases, and it's wrong the limbic system process. And limbic system is also at play for long-term memory. So how exactly does it do this? We look at the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary axis, which is on this responsible for leading this continuous release of cortisol. So while cortisol initially suppresses inflammation, prolong it disrupts it. Immune dysregulation. Persistent high cortisol levels lead to immune dysregulation, and the immune system becomes activated or suppressed. This imbalance can trigger or worsen the immune response. It causes inflammation through the release of pro inflammatory cytokines. Heightened inflammatory states contributes or exacerbates autoimmune diseases. And we talked about, the mind body connection and emotions and how these factors like stress and emotions, it impacts our immune responses and the cytokine production, leading to an imbalance between pro inflammatory and anti inflammatory cytokines. This completely imbalances and can promote autoimmunity. And we're going to get a little bit into molecular mimicry. Stress can alter the immune system's ability to distinguish self and non-self. So this molecular mimicry where the immune system attacks its own body tissues. I hate myself. Okay, body. Okay, mind. Body's going to listen. It's going to start attacking yourself. The epigenetic changes. So, epigenetic transmission of trauma goes back 3 generations. We'll just use the Holocaust. That's where the studies are done. Modifies gene expressions without altering DNA sequences. Literally, your ancestors' stress, emotions, altered their gene expression. And these changes get passed down to you and affects your immune function and your risk for autoimmune disease. And autoimmune in my world, where mind body psychology overlap, is a chronic fight response. Someone always wants to fight. Remember, I'm a former boxer too. Fight response. This involves the amygdala. The amygdala is responsible for emotions and stress. And we talked about, something called neuroception, what happens before the limbic system. Our brain scans for neuroception. 80% of people with autoimmune diseases are women. How often, as a woman, do you feel safe walking to your car at midnight from the grocery store? Odds are you probably don't. You make sure you're like me and my daughter, we are home from the grocery store before it's dark. And this isn't even something we think about anymore as women. We just know. And if you go at night, how heightened are you? Awareness, like that long tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. So think about the amygdala is constantly scanning. And we talked about the brain fog. What's really important for memory is the regulation of the HPA axis, and this can damage the hippocampus, which is responsible for helping you memorize things. The hippocampus is very important for memory function. Stress impairs it. That's why, as a child, if you're in a chronic fight response, you don't remember much. It might not be that you had some traumatic event. Maybe you did. And by the way, science shows you don't need to go find it out. But let's say there's no major trauma event. The odds are, if you don't remember much, you were in fight or flight. And you might think, oh my God, a great childhood. But really rewind it. You probably did have a great childhood. But also, did you feel like you were on eggshells or couldn't express yourself or avoiding things? So when we look at this HPA axis and the stress response, it releases these hormones. Essentially, it gets down to something called ACTH. And it travels to the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands are on top of the kidneys. And that promotes secretion of cortisol. Now we're getting into thyroid. So all my beautiful souls out there who have thyroid autoimmune conditions, this is your cue, you're up. This is the thyroid gland produces hormones critical for metabolizing various body functions. The HPA is linked with the thyroid's HPA thyroid axis. So hormone imbalance, immune dysregulation, metabolic effects. All these things are taking place. So chronic stress dysregulates hormone balance, leading conditions such as hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. So prolonged cortisol interferes production of thyroid hormones. Immune dysregulation, HPA axis influences the immune function of the thyroid gland with things such as Hashimoto's, Graves' disease, and the immune system attacking the thyroid gland, often exacerbated by stress. when you start linking these things together, the disease process, the interaction between stress and the HPA axis, fight response, limbic, the thyroid is very susceptible. And hyperthyroidism, autoimmune thyroid disease, this relationship is the underscore for the interplay between psychological and physiological factors. And look at the limbic system responsible for emotional processing. You're feeling angry most of the time. Odds are with autoimmune. Anger's in there. Been there, done that. Disrupts the emotional processing, impacts where we store memory, impacts the emotional regulation. You're in a chronic stress and limbic activation. This is where it really gets really precision. This impacts neuroinflammation. Neuroinflammation within the limbic system exacerbates the immune response. So, neuroinflammation is the nerve tissue within the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord. So, it's activation of the immune cells, activation of inflammatory mediators, and a couple other blah, blah, blahs in science. Not to downplay it, but sometimes too many words just doesn't really matter. The neuroinflammation is linked to the central nervous system. It is so critical for repairing tissues and tissue damage, fighting infection, and excessive neuroinflammation leads to harmful effects, which it starts to contribute to this pathogenesis, like this beginning of neurological disorders. The genesis of disease is a better way to look at it. When there's neuroinflammation, the genesis of disease begins. And we just got into how neuroinflammation begins. How does it show up? It shows up in multiple sclerosis, where the immune systems target the myelin. Neuroinflammation plays a central role in the genesis of multiple sclerosis, lesions on the brain and spinal cord. It also plays a part in Guillain-Barré syndrome, where it's hitting the peripheral nerves. It's immune-mediated damage to the myelin sheath and other peripheral nerves. Another one is neuromyelitis optica. It's someone that has had a form of optic neuritis and vision loss, even paralysis. Neuroinflammation plays a key role in the demyelination of this. Think, who did you grow up with? Did you have an avoidant father, avoidant mother? Were you chronically invalidated? Do you grow up anxious? Are you always trying to people please? What's your attachment style? Were you not able to express your emotions? And were you stuffing down anger? Impacts HPA axis, the memory, now neuroinflammation. So, and it takes a little pit stop in the GI tract first. Neuroinflammation is this really complex way of the immune system activating a response in the central nervous system. Super normal to have it, but after a prolonged period of time, it just becomes the birthplace for autoimmune disease. So think of it, all of this kind of leading this thread down into the mind-body connection. Stress goes to the gut first. The gut goes back up to the brain. It's going to start doing a cytokine response, inflammation everywhere. That also is going to talk to the HPA axis. That's going to talk to the pituitary. It's going to tick off all the thyroid hormones. And that's going to even go deeper. And that's going to get to neuroinflammation and start getting down into the central nervous system. So we're hitting things like lupus, multiple sclerosis, thyroid conditions, GI autoimmune conditions. We're just kind of systemically, the whole body, tackling everything. This is how important the mind-body connection is, the interplay between science and psychology. You can learn more about this actually and do this do this podcast in conjunction with a workbook I developed. Because, this is it is. It's, a lot to take in and it's a lot to think about. So I developed this workbook that you guys can use to follow along with the podcast, just so it doesn't seem so, hard to digest. And no pun intended, but pun may be intended. It just seems a little bit easier if you have something in writing to follow along with it to break down chronic invalidation and how it's impacting your health and all these other things. So, this workbook and the podcast, it's pretty much like having a one on one session with me and what it looks like to work with me. Finally, we have a book release date. And you can pre order now. It's October 20th. The first book will be released. And the first book is Empower Your Child to Heal, and it's 8 ways to help your child heal through autoimmune anxiety and GI disorders, going over, the science and psychology. And that'll be out the 20th, but you can order it now, Amazon and Audible. And the second book coming out is Empower Yourself to Heal. And it's 8 ways to master your mind. And it's what I've talked about, the science and psychology merging. There also is an online workshop coming up in October. It's going to go over all this. I'm going to help answer personal questions. You can even tell me your story a little bit within a reasonable time frame, and I'll give real world examples on how to heal it. So please feel free to pre-order the book. You can find it on my website, drskylar.net, and you can find the workbook too, so you can work along in this podcast. And also, if you go to the website, you can start getting some free downloads. I actually have a free download of a chapter of the book called Healing Phases, and it's helping you identify what healing phase you're in, which is completely relevant to the healing process. And you get free monthly newsletters about what's going on and sneak peeks and tips that I don't talk about in the podcast or not released in the book yet. And you can find it at drskylar.net. Abundant blessings, beautiful souls.
Thank you for your time. I feel so grateful you have listened to the end. When we begin to understand how our body manifests stress, trauma, depression, anxiety, and even unexpressed emotions, we then create a space and bandwidth in our minds to begin to heal our bodies. Healing is a decision, and I am grateful for yours. Abundant blessings, Dr. Schuyler.
To learn more about the work Dr. Schuyler is doing, please visit drskylar.net. That's drskyler.net. And remember to subscribe to this podcast wherever you like to listen.
Produced by Autovita Studios. Connect your voice to the world.